Welcome to the Life of Learning podcast. I'm Justus Frank, and today I would like to just again develop this thought further on the limitations of language, discussing what it means to have language and some of the difficulties that come with language. In some of my previous podcasts, I've talked about this before, and I particularly made reference to Thomas Paine's book, The Age of Reason, and his point there: human language is local and changeable, and it's incapable of being used as a means of unchangeable and universal information. When we're communicating with someone, when we're having conversations with someone, we want to try and point to things that they have also experienced. We want to point to things outside of ourselves that both people have access to. And that's because language becomes more useful the more shared meaning we have together. And so if we have a common understanding of that word, the more valuable that word becomes. Having a conversation and being able to communicate with someone else can actually be quite a tricky thing. And this is why I think he particularly talks about the whole fact that human language is quite local, and sometimes we don't think about how local it really is. For instance, obviously, language is local in the sense that we all speak a certain language. I'm speaking to you in English, and there's other languages that people speak in. So when we think of an object like my watch, for instance, while I say the word watch, that doesn't necessarily mean the same in every language. Other languages have different names for it. So in German, this is an Uhr. And yeah, I know that there was one occasion in particular, I do speak German, and it's interesting or somewhat amusing to note, for instance, that the word gift, in English, it means a present that you give someone, and in German, it means poison. So, simply making sounds with our mouth, which is basically what speaking is, doesn't necessarily mean that it is meaningful to someone else. And obviously, if we have shared meanings of what certain sounds are with other people, then we can communicate with them better, and this is basically what language is. But even if we speak the same language, for instance English, there are also still local differences within languages. So here I live in New Zealand, and we have certain phrases and words that we use that aren't that common elsewhere in the world. For instance, I remember growing up, when we first arrived here in New Zealand, my family and I, we went along to an event and we were asked to bring a plate. Unfortunately, we didn't understand that bring a plate didn't mean simply bring an empty plate so you can put food on it. It meant bring a plate with food on it to share with everybody else. I come from quite a large family, but I think it was still alright in the end that I think there was still enough food to go around. And we've also got, in subcultures, there's all sorts of subcultures where certain meanings of words are more prevalent and are used in particular ways. These might be in religious subcultures, such as Christian subculture, where certain words such as maybe grace, it's another very big word, propitiation, and some, or the word faith. There's certain words that are used in certain subcultures that aren't generally used in everyday sort of life, but only in these sort of areas. And then there's also specific languages used in certain jobs. And then within our families and also our friendship circles, we also have certain language and certain things that we say. There's basically in-jokes within our families and within our circle of friends that exactly are a bit foreign often to people looking in, and we don't quite understand what's going on. And sometimes I head out and do some Uber driving, and sometimes I hear people talking, for instance, in the back, and I'm really not understanding what they're saying. I understand they're speaking the same language, but just the way that they're talking to each other in such a familiar term, I'm just not within their friendship circle, within what they're talking about, that I don't really know what they're talking about. Even though I can understand the individual words to a certain extent, the context and everything, and the familiarity that they have with each other means that I'm not capable of following along. And so we basically see this principle at play, that the closer you are to someone and the more time that you spend with them and the more conversations you have with them, the more shared meanings you will have with that person in the language that you use. And that's why conversations are so important, particularly with those who we want to be close to and those who we love. Because the more conversations we have, the more opportunities we have to come to a more shared understanding of the language we use. And as you know, my passion is, in particular, the closest relationships that we have are families, and so building those relationships is a key part of what I intend to talk about. And so, yeah, I encourage people to have more conversations within their families. There's often a common complaint between parents and teenagers in particular that there's a struggle of communication. And of course, again, the answer to that, I believe, is to have more conversations. If you're struggling to have a shared understanding, then you have to have more conversations. But it's not the easiest thing, if you haven't been having conversations with them in the past, to start having those conversations. And so obviously it's very important that we have conversations with children right through their formative years. The challenge is these days that, from what I see in the world around me, is that not enough of these conversations are taking place. And I make that case simply by looking at the time that is available in a day and the time that is available for people to actually have conversations. People often perpetuate, I guess, this myth of, well, it's more about quality rather than quantity. Unfortunately, the less quantity you have, the less quality the time will actually be. You don't have, the less time you spend with someone, exactly, the less shared meaning you have, and the harder it is actually to reach a state of quality time. So, yeah, when I look at people's general sort of day, I mean, most people start the day early, everybody rushes around, getting ready for work and getting ready for school, and exactly, most of the talking that goes on is in terms of organisation. It's not about trying to really find out where the children are at, having any sort of deep conversation. And so, yeah, people rush off to school, and then after school, often children are shuttled around various activities, things like that. And again, there's not much time for conversation. There might be some conversation depending on the family over dinner time, but again, I see a lot of families seem to do this rather quickly as well, and time before and after dinner is often spent looking at some sort of screen. And then, of course, the children need to go to bed as early as possible because they need to get a certain amount of sleep because they need to be woken up early again the next morning. And so my question is, when do people actually find time to have these conversations with their children? And this is a reason why I'm such an advocate of living a freer life, living as a free agent, not having your time dictated by a certain job or by school, but rather living life more on your own terms. And I think that is certainly possible. I'm not going to go into all the details in this podcast here, but I definitely think that life is possible, choosing to live a freer life. So, in an earlier podcast, I also mentioned what's called the Feynman technique. So the Feynman technique was named after the Nobel-winning physicist Richard Feynman, and it was basically a formula he created of how you can basically learn anything and understand anything better than anyone else. And he basically laid it out like this. First, you need to identify the subject. Then you need to teach it to a child, or so really simplify down the language. And then 3, go back and reflect, identify your knowledge gaps, and then 4, reorganize and simplify once again. And I've dwelt on this point before, the importance of being able to explain something in simple language. And obviously this is a challenge for me as well. I know sometimes I am not quite as simple as what I would like to be, and it's something that I'm trying to work on. If we are using more simple language, we are also using more common language. And if we are using more common language, it means that we have a more shared meaning of what those words mean. And both for ourselves and for other people listening. And that's why it's so helpful in terms of helping us learn, because we've actually simplified it down to something that is understandable for our own minds, but also it is more understandable for other people as well, because we have that shared meaning together. And then there's also the further problem that no two people will actually have the same mental picture of a specific word or phrase. Yes, the more similar two people's mental images are, the more understandable they are to each other. But how do we get to a point where we have the same mental image? And we're never going to fully get that. But if I were to say to you, for instance, there's a bird outside, you'd probably have some sort of mental image in your head, and maybe it would be of some very common bird like a sparrow, it might be a raven, it might be an ostrich, who knows. But perhaps when I think of a bird at the moment, I'm thinking of a bird that is quite common around here, and it's called a pukeko. And so these differences, when we have these very broad concepts like a bird, what we end up picturing in our head as a mental image can be substantially different. Now, if we do decide to get more specific, say for instance that I say there's a pukeko outside, then that does become more specific, but it also means that you need to have a more specific shared meaning of what I'm actually talking about, which is sometimes harder to get to. Exactly, you probably will have had to have spent some time in New Zealand, or possibly actually also Australia. I believe they also live in Australia, to understand what I'm actually talking about. Because it's not a common bird elsewhere in the world. So this is the thing. So in order to have this mental picture of a pukeko in your head, you need to have access some of the similar experiences that I've experienced in my life. In other words, I've seen a pukeko. And, there'll be animals, if you live elsewhere in the world, there'll be animals that you know and that you've experienced that I haven't, and maybe if you start talking to me about them, I don't actually know what you're talking about until I've gone and looked it up. So this is really important, that we have these shared experiences for us to actually be able to get specific about things, and for us to have similar mental pictures within our own heads. So we need to remember that nouns are simply the result of combining or uniting individual instances that we've decided to merge, because humans are pattern-seeking creatures and we like combining things with similar features. When I say, for instance, the word pukeko, there are hundreds, thousands of pukeko out there. And while it is a more specific word than just bird, there are again limitations to how specific I can be, because exactly if I were to be too specific, then I would be just describing one bird, one particular pukeko, rather than pukekos in general. So the reason why I'm kind of going into this, and hopefully that wasn't too confusing, is that I had this conversation just the other day with my girlfriend regarding abstract nouns, and the fact that abstract nouns are not things. They're not entities, they're not things that we can touch. They're simply descriptions of individual instances that have a lot of similarity between them. So for instance, if I use the word courage, so if someone, for instance, if I see someone jumping into a river to save someone from drowning, and then I also see someone standing up and speaking the truth, even though there might be a significant backlash or something to them speaking the truth, there's enough similarities between those two actions that I can say those are both instances of courage. And so as we see from this, when we're talking about abstract nouns, they're not things, they're just a way of combining some of the similarities that we see in individual instances. Same thing with love. We might see people showing affection to each other. We might see, and that might be done in different ways. It might be a couple kissing, or it might be a mother looking after her baby. But all of these instances, when we look at the similarities and we understand that it has something to do with affection and the way that two humans interact with each other, and then we see those similarities and then we call that love. We can see some of the similarities of instances in the past, and then when we see it in real time, in the present, we can identify actions that are similar in some aspect to things in the past, and then we can state, well, that's love, they're showing love, or that person is showing courage. And just to put a more practical tone to what I'm saying, I think we need to be really careful with what actions we combine as being similar, so that we can attach the label of, for instance, courage or love. Because unfortunately too often in this world we attach the word love, for instance, to actions that are both affectionate and then also to actions that are violent. So too many people often still grow up in households where it is stated that hitting a child, for instance, spanking a child, is an act of love, And so we get this mixed message that love consists of both affection and violence. And that's a quite an interesting message, psychological message that we grow up with often. And trying to untangle that, or not being able to untangle that, can often lead to disastrous consequences for those people who aren't able to differentiate between violent actions and affectionate actions, because they're being combined in such a way, both using the word love. And so, I think we need to be very careful with this word, and it's again something that I'm becoming increasingly passionate about, is to not combine actions that really are opposite in nature. So in conclusion, I once again want to state, how is it that we can communicate more effectively? And it basically, consists of spending more time together with people, having more conversations, and acting more consistently in our actions, so that we can, as we spend this time together, that we can increase the shared meaning that we have between the two people involved. And the more shared meaning that we have, the more detailed and in-depth our conversations can actually become, and the more profound and deeper the concepts and ideas that we can explore. So I hope this has been helpful again, as a way of thinking about all of this. Again, I would love to hear from you as well if you are finding these interesting, and you have your own thoughts regarding all of this. So thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you soon. Alright, thanks, bye.